Love is learned and relationships are learned. So we're being taught from the moment we are born or even conceived what our parenting, what our caregiving is going to be like. And that teaches us about what we can expect from others and the world from the tiniest age. So yes, if we have, as we say in therapy, good enough parenting, which is just consistent enough, affirming enough, calm and emotionally regulating enough, that's what's going to help us have a secure attachment, because we grow up feeling that our needs will be tended to, people want and can meet our needs, we are loved, we are enough, we are okay. So we have a very calm nervous system growing up, and we develop in secure ways, and we can then attach securely because there's not a lot of blocks to us giving and receiving love, because that's what we've been taught growing up. So very fortunate for those of us who experience that.
Well, Charisse Cooke, welcome to Passion Love Pursuit. I'm so excited to dive into our conversation today. As I was mentioning, it's one of my favorites.
Yes, Erica, I think you and I are going to have lots to chat about, I have no doubt.
So I would love to just dive right in, because I know your specialty is attachment theory, and I would love for you to just explain to us why it is important to understand our attachment style and how having this awareness can we then change the dynamics in our relationships with ourselves and also in romantic partnership.
Thank you. Yes. Well, I mean, attachment gives us a really interesting roadmap and tool and mirror to understand the way we relate. Because I think when I'm working with clients, things can feel so confusing very quickly in our love relationships. They can feel nonsensical or baffling. And attachment theory gives us a really good reason for why we are behaving the way that we behave in relationships. And I think that's key to self-awareness and our own personal development.
Great. So I think it's very important we actually understand what this attachment theory is and what are these attachment styles that most people find a camp in. There's four main ones. If you could kind of walk us through this so we could deeply understand possibly where we sit in at
For
this present
sure.
moment, that is.
You're absolutely right. There are four kinds of ways of attaching, and I like thinking of them as ways of attaching because these are attachment possibilities, if you like, and it's useful for us to recognize ourselves in all of them, because I think often we have a dominant way of attaching, but also what I notice and what my book is about is how we can behave in different ways with different people in different environments, and so it's useful to have an understanding of all the attachment styles. So the first attachment style is secure attachment, which, as the name suggests, is when we feel safe, we feel secure, there's an ease around relationships, and there's a relaxation in relationships. They're not scary or overwhelming or anxiety provoking. So there's a sense of security and okayness. And then there are two kinds of other attachment styles. There's anxious attachment, which also, as the name suggests, means that we experience a bit of stress around relationships. Our attachments are sources of anxiety. We can be preoccupied with our relationships. We can overfunction. We can be have a lot of concern and worry around our relationships. So that then means that we have an anxious attachment. And then the other attachment style is avoidant attachment. And avoidant attachment speaks of relationships being quite stressful for us, so we kind of shut down as a way of coping, as a way of seeing through. We can be quite detached. We can be quite scathing sometimes even. There are, in fact, two kinds of avoidant attachment. There's dismissive avoidant, where we can put our partners down, we can be a bit unkind, we like to create distance, and we do that by being a bit offhand, being a bit dismissive. And we're also dismissive of relationships generally. We don't feel we need relationships. They're not that important. They're not a big deal. If they start being a bit too challenging, well, that's obviously not right. So we'll just move on. Relationships shouldn't really require work. Those are kind of some of the sort of avoidant beliefs that we will have. And then the final one is what I call fearful avoidant attachment, which is also known as disorganized attachment. And that's an interesting little mixture of both, where there's a lot of anxiety in the relationship, or our view of relationships. So there's fear and worry and hypervigilance, but at the same time, there's the avoidance, and there's the stepping away from relationships and not wanting them and fearing them. And so it's an interesting mix. Dismissive avoidant is quite low anxiety, quite unemotional, and fearful avoidant is quite high anxiety, high emotional. And often relationships, if we're fearful avoidant, can be a bit chaotic. This is when we have our addictive relationships, our dysfunctional relationships, our high conflict relationships. So you can see, there's sort of similarities in all of these ways, really, especially the insecure attachments. And that's why I think it's a good idea for us to recognize, I'm being a bit avoidant in this moment, or, oh, my anxious attachment is really playing out. We can begin to understand ourselves through each lens.
It's so good. I think just by walking through those four, I think anybody listening could really understand like where they gravitate towards and possibly why,
Okay.
and they could notice the patterns. And this is what it's really about, is the patterns we've formed over time. And usually they do stem from childhood. So I would love for you to, if you could kind of explain these patterns that show up in our relationships. What are some behaviors or situations, circumstances that somebody grew up in that possibly influenced this patterning in their adult relationships?
That's such a good point, because love is learned and relationships are learned. So we're being taught from the moment we are born or even conceived what our parenting, what our caregiving is going to be like. And that teaches us about what we can expect from others and the world from the tiniest age. So yes, if we have, as we say in therapy, good enough parenting, which is just consistent enough, affirming enough, calm and emotionally regulating enough, that's what's going to help us have a secure attachment, because we grow up feeling that our needs will be tended to, people want and can meet our needs, we are loved, we are enough, we are okay. So we have a very calm nervous system growing up, and we develop in secure ways, and we can then attach securely because there's not a lot of blocks to us giving and receiving love, because that's what we've been taught growing up. So very, very fortunate for those of us who experience that. The insecure attachments, the anxious and the avoidant attachment. Let's start off with the anxious attachment. That's when there's often an inconsistency of the care, of the parenting. It's kind of, sometimes our parents are there for us and can meet our needs, and then sometimes they're not. And sometimes there's a sense of people being able to meet our needs and then people not. And then this, you can understand, then creates a sense in us of, well, are people there and where are they? And so we become a little bit hypervigilant. In child studies, this is when we see children are very, very clingy, very hyper aware of where their caregiver is at all times, because there's a little bit of fear there right from early age of, hold on, I can't just rely on someone looking after me, because sometimes I cry and there isn't someone to look after me, or I'm sort of met in a sort of severe way. So it just creates in us this anxiety, this insecurity of, I'm not sure I can rely on people. And so how we adapt to that is also kind of, how do I keep people close? So this is when we are good little children and little entertainers, or funny or cute or helpful. We start learning, oh, I better do something to keep my caregivers close, because then they'll care for me. So there's this anxiety around relationships. It's not just freely given. It's something that perhaps has a degree of work associated to it.
Just to ask in regards to what you're speaking about now, would you say that's where people pleasing might come in, the behavior as we're adult, developing that because we're trying to make sure we get love back, if you want to say, keep it close?
Absolutely right. That's a great observation. Yeah, our people pleasing is about securing people's, affirmation, validation, and ultimately their positive thoughts about us, and therefore their love. So yeah, we learn to not be ourselves, but what we imagine our environment and our caregivers might want from us, and so that means being good or being helpful, not making a fuss, or and then as we grow, this can turn into codependency, and we can have codependent
Mhm.
relationships, and we can have issues around control in relationships, because there's just this anxiety in us around relationships. They are not calm, relaxing things for us. There's a degree of preoccupation and there's a degree of worry. So the anxiety is really, really there.
Yeah.
And conversely, then for the avoidant attachers, they too will experience perhaps inconsistent care. But sometimes there's a step further with that, where there's a criticism, there's actual kind
Mm.
of, we don't want your emotions, put them away. So we learn to shut down our emotions, and as children, as humans, we are so emotional, and rather than our emotions sort of being met or regulated with us, or kind of responded to with love and care, they can be responded to. Stop being dramatic, stop being silly, you're overwhelmed, don't have a tantrum, and getting punished for feelings. And there's a sort of love doesn't feel, it comes with a lot of negative associations around when we are vulnerable with people. It hasn't
Mhm.
paid off for us. And so in a way, we learn to cut off from our emotions. We learn to not have emotions, even though we often do. And so we reject ourselves. We feel rejected by our caregivers in a way. And so we learn to reject ourselves. And then we also learn to reject others. And then that's why in our adulthood, when people come to us with their needs, we are often very rejecting and dismissive and uninterested, because that is actually what we experienced growing up. So it's a
Mm.
learned behavior that we've really then taken on as our own. So it's a very, very sad in a way, because there's a real lack there. There's a real deprivation. Emotional development hasn't been able to take place. And then, so too, with the other avoidant attachment, the fearful avoidant or disorganized attachment, that's when we've been raised in homes that perhaps, were really not very functional. They were not loving. Maybe there were mental health
Mm.
issues that were unaddressed. Maybe there were active addictions that really, really impacted our sense of security, our caregivers' ability to meet our needs. There's a lot of preoccupation with other things going on. And the environment itself can often feel extremely unsafe. And, if people are struggling with mental health issues or addictions or their own volatile relationships, again, we grow up with fear. We don't grow up with calm and security. We grow up with, oh, there's a lot of fighting, or people are unpredictable. I don't know what kind of mood people are going to be. And so there's this fear that really is quite pronounced in us. And so we are both highly anxious. We develop anxiety and avoidance as ways of coping. And so then as we grow up, we will choose people, and the patterns will continue, as you say, and relationships continue to be these sources of stress for us, and difficulty and dysfunction.
Yeah. You know what I find so interesting about learning about these attachment styles is not only it helps you deeply understand yourself, it helps you have compassion and
Mm.
empathy for others. And I think that is really when you're breaking through the walls, is that
Mm.
awareness like, oh, this came from this. Now I deeply understand why I have these triggers or
Mm.
these reactions in relationship. And, as I've learned more about and having these interviews about attachment styles, I've come to understand, because one of my biggest struggles in my life has been in relationship. And
Mm.
I've shared this on podcasts. I started dating at a very young age, 13, and I had a long-term relationship to 23. So 13 to 23.
Wow.
And in that relationship, there was emotional abuse. So it affected me and my growth into becoming a
Mm.
woman, and so it really set the foundation for relationships to come. And
Yeah.
I noticed my pattern my struggle was definitely, and it's like clear as day for me now, that I was anxious attachment, and I had codependency issues. I definitely would, I felt like I was being somebody that I thought that person would like in some of my
Mm.
relationships. Like I felt a little disconnected from who I was because I yet to know who I was. I was still in my self-discovery path. But, with that awareness, it helped me when I really dived into the personal development space and I started turning the mirror on myself and saying, like, enough is enough. Why does this keep happening? Heartbreak after heartbreak. And when I turned that mirror on myself, I was able to really get radically honest with myself and take responsibility for the part I play in my own misery. And I think that is when you really shift into your own transformation. And so I would love to talk about
Mm.
this ownership, that's this responsibility of our patterning and understanding where it comes from and then rewriting a new narrative, because it really is relearning and unlearning those behaviors
Mm.
that formed from a very young age. So if you could kind of share about that, about taking the responsibility and ownership for our own patterning with that awareness.
I think, yeah, that's so key, isn't it? That's so right what you're saying. And I think particularly for those of us who recognize a more anxious way of attaching, one of the biggest issues I think around that is we want the other person to come in and make everything okay. That speaks
Yeah.
of the lack in our history, right? Of we didn't really get it the way we wanted it from appropriately from our caregivers. And so then as we have these adult relationships, in your case very very young, and for many people having these young relationships, there's still that desire for the other person to come in and love us enough and give us what we need. And whilst I believe relationships can be and are hugely healing, there is some work that relationships simply cannot do. And it is the work that we need to do ourselves, because we missed out on certain developmental milestones through whatever did or did not happen for us growing up. And so our self-work in our adulthood, if we are able to do it, and if we're able to kind of wake up in our lives and give ourselves this gift, is to develop in the ways that we unfortunately were not able to develop when we were younger. And that's through no fault of our own and nothing that we did wrong. Um, but we can really just become aware of I am missing some of these key pieces, and I can create that in myself, and I can do it the way I want to do it, in a way that feels good for me. And so it can be a really empowering moment for us, which I think is so vital. So, yeah, realizing that and embracing that can be the turning point for us, because my upset that I don't want anyone to ever feel in relationships is to not feel that we are dignified in our relationships, that we can feel good about who we are in relationships, and we can feel good about how we behave and how we conduct ourselves. And when we're insecurely attached, whether anxious or avoidant, sometimes we can behave in ways that it's just not right, and it's not who we are. I think that's also key. That's not who we are. We need to find out who we are more in a more authentic way, actually. So I think really
I
recognize. Sorry, yeah.
No, I was going to say, I love that you say that it's not truly who we are. It's our
Mm,
reactions and patterns that we've developed that has actually, if anything, separated us from who we are.
that's right. That's absolutely right. It's kind of, as I've got older in my own life, and friends and family and myself, we have children and we watch children grow up, then you really do see, the perfect, beautiful little angels as they are. And then as they grow, life happens and relationship happens and misfortune happens. And I think it's so, it is a tragedy what we can become. And I think that's our self work, is really, do we want to be part of that, or do we just want to become what life's going to make us? There's something about really remaining true to ourselves and who we truly are takes effort. Because actually, if we're just asleep and unconscious, we will live life defended. We will live life
Mm.
in a reactionary survivalist way that is not who we are at all. So I think really recognizing that anxious attachment, avoidant attachment is a defense. So therefore, what are we defending? What are we protecting? And how can we defend ourselves and look after ourselves in more effective ways? How can we
Mm.
learn to have boundaries? How can we learn to challenge the distorted thinking that we have because of the terrible messages we received growing up or in previous relationships, in, really emotionally incorrect and inappropriate relationships? We will have learned things. We need to unlearn them, as you say. And so recognizing we're going to have distorted thinking, we're going to have inaccurate beliefs about ourselves, we're going to have possibly immature understanding of love and relationships, and certainly adult relationships, what those even look like. And we don't communicate particularly well. We don't communicate with composure and care and consideration. And we can develop our self-esteem by having boundaries and, doing things in a way that feels really esteeming. So sort of taking back that power and control over our own lives and recognizing that that is down to us is the very, very hard work of really changing things and changing who we attract and are attracted to, which I think is another big thing in our relationships, because
Oh
rather
my gosh,
than
yeah.
us just going for, what's familiar, we can be very intentional about, if I'm not defended, if I'm not coming from a place of trauma or attachment, insecurity, who will I choose? What will I value in a partner? We get to have some pretty exciting conversations with ourselves.
Oh, it's so good. And the one thing that I want people listening, like when you discover possibly your patterning and what, let's say,
Mm,
attachment style you have, don't start being hard on yourself. Cause I think,
mm,
I- when I started listening to him and thinking about my past, I'm like, oh, I start to feel sad for myself that that's my
mm,
reaction and where I was coming from. But then on the other side, I also feel like, oh, I have so much compassion for her, because whatever reason, because I'm kind of the rare one that doesn't remember a lot of my childhood, like from
mm.
age 10 and before, I don't remember. But I do think because I started dating at such a young age, I actually started dating at 11. So as I'm not even an adult yet, I'm starting to get all these range
Yeah.
emotions, sorry. And so I think it just influenced this need to feel loved. And because I hadn't developed this self-love and confidence in myself yet, it was shaped by the other. And so,
Mm,
but I want people to know, like, hearing this and possibly to understand yourself more, don't be hard on yourself. But yet, with this awareness, now this is when you could really take the driver's seat of your life. And so, can you tell us what after awareness, then what to change these patterns that we've had for so long to
mm.
be able to attract a more healthy partnership?
I think once we have the awareness and we can apply that to our life, and we then get something that some of us don't always want, and it's quite a big responsibility, and that is we have choice. Because when we're in reactivity and when we're in survival, we're not really choosing how we behave. We're in some sort of fight, freeze or fawn. We're going to defend ourselves, stick up for ourselves. We're going to fight the other person. And that is not a thoughtful space. That is a real primitive space that's appropriate in certain circumstances, but not our intimate relationships. And so we can begin to exercise choice, which, as I say, is a big responsibility, because that is very, very effortful and it's very, very difficult. And I think it's also important to recognize that we can recognize a more anxious attachment style in our desire to do things differently, in our desire to change and grow. And we can hold ourselves to very high standards and want so much for ourselves. And we can be very hard on ourselves, as you say, terribly hard on ourselves. And we, in a way, are fortunate to have that because we are the ones that will read the books and do the work and do the self work. And I think there's great opportunity there. But let's not also forget that the other ways of attaching, the more avoidant ways of attaching, part of their defense is I don't need to do the work. I'm okay how I
Mm.
am. Everyone else is the problem. So sometimes when I'm working, which as I do with couples and people in relationships, there's one person that can take on a huge amount of the responsibility, the lion's share of responsibility in relationships, and the other person is just like very happy for that to happen. And so, in a way, once we have awareness that we are perhaps feeling more anxious, or we have the awareness that we're feeling more avoidant, the work is very, very interesting. I often say to my anxiously attached people, your work is to do less of what you have been
Mm.
doing and to do maybe 50% of what you have been doing, but to do it in incredibly intentional, specific ways. So I will say, I will give to my anxiously attached clients, okay, we're going to do assertiveness work. You and I, we're going to
Mm.
really focus on assertiveness, communicating a certain way, making requests, expressing our needs with, dignity and decorum and appropriately. That's the work that I want us to do. And for you to really, really take that other 50% that you were going to give, and we're going to give that straight back into self-care, self-love, and you and your life, your friends, your career, your creativity. Let's do it. And then I will work with the more avoidantly attached person or people, and I will say, we need to ratchet things up by 50%. You need to start doing more. And this is going to be really, really difficult because so much of our avoidance is around denial. We don't need to do that. Why do we need to do that? And so
Right.
the work is different. Someone's often has to do less, but more of the really, personal work. And then the other person actually needs to do more of work in the relationship, more effort, more listening, more participation. So it's kind of once the awareness is there, in a way, what I want to do is I want it to strip away a lot of the noise to get to the very specific things that we need to stretch ourselves on within ourselves and within our relationships to really, really focus on those, because awareness alone isn't enough, because we can beat ourselves up or we can beat our partners up and point the finger at them, and blame is a very, very, very common thing. But I think
Right.
it is different for different people, and it's often small things that require a lot of effort and focus, and often it's the things that we don't really want to do. The things that each attachment style naturally lends themselves to is not what we need to develop, is it? We've already got an overdeveloped sense of that. We need to work on developing other things that are much, much more focused.
Ooh, I love that you explain the difference of each and the different actions that they need to focus on. And that is really key, is the anxious attachment is more developing a self-love and self-trust and self-respect, developing
Mm-hmm.
healthy boundaries and asserting yourself. These are great tangible things that somebody, if they're seeing that they're in that camp of what they should be addressing, instead of
Mm-hmm.
focusing so much energy onto the relationship, it's really just turning the mirror on themselves and cultivating that within themselves, those needs. And again, it's not necessarily, it is work. I mean, it's the inner work, right? This is the personal development and really cultivating that foundation within ourselves so that we could enter a healthy partnership and be in a secure attachment. And this is the work I did because that was obviously exactly what I needed. And luckily, I happen to be in a very secure relationship. Both of us are secure. We definitely both, before this relationship, had those different patternings where I, as expressed, was anxious attachment. And so if I did not do that work, I would not be able to maintain this healthy relationship about to enter marriage. And, so it,
Mm-hmm.
I just want to give you hope it changes, because like I said, I completely struggled in my relationships and had a lot of heartbreaks because of it. But I, again, not that I was the cause to it all, and I don't want anybody listening to this to think they're the
Mm.
cause. I think we all play a part in our own misery, but we have to be willing to be honest with ourselves, because the more we avoid it, then we're just
Mm.
repeating the same pattern over and over. As they say, different package, or sorry, same package, different bow, as we go into the
Ah.
next relationship, if we don't learn how we are showing up. And so I think,
Mm.
if anything, it empowers you to be in the driver's seat of your life. But I love that you also talk
Mm.
about, sorry to be unraveling this so much, but you talk about the dismissive and avoidant of how they think they'll come and act like they're not at fault.
Mm.
But again, they still have a fear. They're operating from a fear-based place, and
Mm.
in that, their reaction is to avoid. So I love that you work on each person differently, because I think that's very
Mm.
important. So would you say for somebody to move into a secure attachment really comes down to the work of unlearning their behaviors? Like, what would be another suggestion of how we could begin to move into a secure attachment, because it's possible
Mm.
for all of us?
I definitely believe it is possible. But I love your story, and thank you so much for sharing it. And I think something that is very powerful about your story that I do think really, really matters is who we are choosing to have in our life. Because yes, I guess there are two aspects of it, isn't there? There's who we're choosing to have in our life, and then there's how we are behaving. And we have control over both these things. And if we choose someone who we know is, at the end of the day, I say, a kind, decent human being who's prepared to put in some work, and then you really have something to work with. However, if we're choosing someone that is really shut down, closed, in a very fixed position, that's when we are in a very, very difficult space, because yes, we can change our behavior. And that's what I would encourage people to do, is look at yourself, develop yourself, grow, mature, really do that for yourself, because that does create change in a relationship. It absolutely does. And over time, I've seen a lot of relationships turn around as a result of that. But I also know that there can be a huge amount of pain in relationships that fundamentally are not going to go the distance with us, that are not going to go anywhere near the distance that we want to go. And I often say developing secure attachment is nervous system work. And so
Mm.
part of that is the person that you're with, or the people that you're dating, or the people you attract, or the people that you allow to choose you, what does that do to your nervous system? And initially, I think in relationships, there's always going to be the anxiety. And so, in a way, what we need to recognize, okay, it's natural to feel anxious, certainly at the beginning when there's so much uncertainty, and there is kind of how often to message and to date, and will they like me or do I like them, and all of that. That's a naturally anxious time. But we need to sort of learn to really honor our nervous system. And if we are with someone that we recognize, and I think those of us who have, these kind of attachments, we should have a pretty good radar about who we are attracting and what we can expect from them, and how likely it is that our nervous system will be able to deactivate with this person. Will we be
Mm.
able to relax? Will we be able to feel secure? Will we be able to be and have the calm, loving relationship that we want? So it really is a mixture between choosing someone that we know is going to be good for us, and doing the work of learning how to communicate, learning how to speak up for ourselves appropriately, having boundaries, participating in ways that are positive and constructive. These two things together, I think, are really, really important, because what I see a lot of beautiful souls doing is just working themselves into the ground, with people, sadly, who just are not right. So we need both. we need both, definitely.
That's so true. And would you say it is possible for, let's say, one of the insecure attachments to then get into a relationship with a secure attachment? And is it possible? Because I believe, and I would love to know your opinion, I believe if it remains that, it will never last. Because usually a secure attachment will get to a point where they're like turned off by certain
Mm.
behaviors. But I would love your opinion on this. I could be wrong. But do you
Mm.
believe also because that secure attachment, how they are responding in the relationship, creating that safety because they have safety within themselves, that they could then help transform that insecure attachment in the relationship and then it could last and be healthy and go on
Mm.
forever, whatever it may be.
Mm. For sure. I mean, that's such a
Two
great
questions in one.
point. And I often can see in my clients, and that this for me is a very exciting development because what we find attractive changes. I can start
Mm.
working with someone and they're like, oh, I can find the unavailable person in a room of 100 people. I'll find the unavailable one that's going to be ambivalent about me. But I just can't help myself. They're so, wonderful or whatever. And then 6 months, 12 months down the line, they were like, oh yeah, I could see the unavailable ambivalent person and that does not do it for me anymore. And it's kind of, that's what I mean about us maturing through the work. Because a lot of people say,
Mm-hmm.
well, what can I do? I like these kind of people. They're who I find attractive. And it's like, it's not. It's what your nervous system is
Familiar.
familiar with, and you're mistaking that for attraction and chemistry. And actually, you don't, we are changing all the time if we allow ourselves. So, who we find attractive can absolutely change. And that will change as we become more secure, or conversely, as we become more insecure. And so I think that is a great little litmus test for ourselves. And but if we are quite secure ourselves and we are doing the work, then we may, our pattern may be that we go for unavailable people or avoidant people. But I think what really moves the dial in a way is the extremeness of the people that we are with. It's kind of, in our heyday, we can go for extremely avoidant people. And that could mean a sort of a dismissive avoidant or a fearful avoidant attacher, where we just have these chaotic relationships with, they're really unesteeming, they're really dysfunctional, and, they're never going to be adult long-term relationships. And so there isn't really much to do there with that. But maybe a little bit further down the spectrum that isn't so extreme, we've got someone, yeah, whose coping strategies are a bit more avoidant. They do struggle sometimes with communication or shutting down or withdrawing. But you know what? They are aware of that and they do want to work on it a little bit. Then anything can happen. So I think that's something to sort of be aware of, is how extreme is the person I'm dating or the person that I'm with, my partner. They have really extreme ways of coping that probably they're not going to change because they certainly don't want to change, can't even, cop to it. Or yes, I'm learning my partner is really avoidant, and when they're stressed or whatever, but then after a day or two, actually we can come together and then things are possible. So I think in that way, there is a fluidity to the way that we attach, especially if we can stay steady and we can stay stable, then that then doesn't escalate things, and we're not then part of the pattern. We are then someone that can see if the people around us can calm and meet us where we're at or not, and then that can inform us about what we choose.
So I'm curious because you're a psychotherapist for a long time now, and I'm sure you work in relationship and then individuals. What do you find in relationship when somebody's in a relationship and they're having, you know, struggles, whatnot? Would you say is more beneficial to have therapy as a couple or individually or both?
That's a great question. Um, I think for me, what's been very successful, and I know a lot of my colleagues do this as well, is both. I work, and not everyone can do this, and not everyone can afford to do this, but it is incredibly helpful to have one-to-one sessions with each of the people in the couple, and to be working on stuff very directly in those sessions, and then have couples therapy together once that's kind of happened. What sort of happens more traditionally is you just have it two people together the whole time. And what I find is that people just want to talk, 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 talk. They want to have their
Yeah.
say over everything. And then the time just goes and there isn't actual time to sort of do the work. So I enjoy meeting people one to one, really understanding them, understanding where they're coming from, building that relationship, and then also challenging them quite sort of directly in the safety of a one-to-one. And I will also really advocate for the other partner in those sessions. And then I will see the other
Beautiful.
partner and do exactly the same, really challenge them, but also really understand them, and then advocate for the other partner. And then I can do that for a period of time. And then doing couples work, we all have a pretty good understanding of what should be worked on, what their goals are, what they understand their kind of areas of growth can be. And there's a familiarity with that, which I find very, very rich. And I think that is really, really helpful, because then people can learn the way they need to in the one-to-ones, and they can both be up to speed. So then by the time they meet as a couple, there's some beautiful work that can take place, and a lot of the sort of venting and everything that needs to take place has already taken place. So that would be my
Beautiful.
recommendation. That's how I work with couples.
I love that. It is so important. I think the more awareness we have and more ability to understand and relate to others, that's what relationships are about, relating. And I
Mm.
think when you have this awareness of yourself and also your partner, you're able to have more understanding and be able to communicate your needs and understand your partner's needs as
Mm.
well. So it's kind of meeting each other where you're at and then able to work on it from there. So I think that's so beautiful. And again, I think that we can evolve in our relationships. I know there's been a tremendous amount of growth in our relationship. Myself and my fiance's, we've been together over 5 years, and there's been so much growth. But it takes the individuals working on themselves, and so
Mm.
that you could come in relationship and then be able to meet each other where you're at. And of course, you
Mm.
have to have a partner that's willing to do that, most importantly. uh, but I
Yeah.
wanted to ask, because you speak heavily on emotional regulation, as you mentioned early on,
Mm.
how does somebody learn to then emotionally regulate and also create safety within themselves? Because it's when we seek safety from another, we're going to be constantly, seeking that, opposed to creating it within ourselves and emotionally regulating. So how can we begin to maybe have a practice of emotional regulation, or what does that look like?
That's key. I would say if there's one thing that you do in your life that will help you, it is learn to recognize when you are emotionally dysregulated, and learn how to then emotionally regulate and deactivate the nervous system. Because when I say emotional deregulation, or anyone does, it means that our nervous system has been activated, and we're in some kind of a trauma response, we're in some kind of survival response. And when that's happening, the parts of the brain that are in charge of empathy and kindness and love, they just shut down, because they're not needed. Though needing to love is not necessary when we're fighting for our life. And in these primitive responses, that's what we think is going on. And our relationships, by their very nature, are so emotional, and they can be such sources of pain and difficulty. And we're going to have conflict, we're going to have disagreement, we're going to have discord, and we will react into that. And I think such a crucial, vital part of our development is recognizing that this reactivity can become incredibly unhelpful, and we have to rein ourselves in. We have to do things differently. We have to learn how to communicate in ways that are not going to be escalating or creating even further conflict. So this would definitely fall under the category of things I really don't want to do because when we are dysregulated, that's when we want to be heard and we're angry and we're just going to say what we want to say and you just need to listen to me and how dare you say that. And this is something I see day after day, week after week in my consulting room. People happily, in a way, dysregulated and just disgorging their unhappiness and their pain and their trauma response into the room. And if we were to think about it even for a minute or two, what good could possibly come from that? We would recognize no good, nothing constructive is going to happen because we want to be heard in that moment, and our partner with us in a dysregulated state has no capacity to hear, just like we have no capacity to hear. So trying to have a conversation is actually a little bit inaccurate. It's not about having a conversation. It is about, we're in a very subjective,
Who's
self-centered
right?
point of view. Right. That's exactly right.
Yeah. And it comes down to,
yeah.
no,
Yeah,
I
we
was
do
going to
not.
say it comes down to everybody trying to be right. So it becomes this conversation like, no, but this, no, but that,
That's it. That's it.
See,
And so it's
and
really human. And in those moments, that really matters to us, right? That's
yes,
when we are emotionally dysregulated. We've lost control of ourselves, because if we were honest with ourselves, we would sort of recognize, I'm not actually in control. Before I'm even thinking, things are out my mouth and I'm saying things and I'm being unkind and I'm, name calling. This is when we do the really destructive behavior in our relationships if we're not careful. And we feel very justified in those moments to do it. And I mean, I do it. We all do it. It's very human. There's nothing in sort of inherently evil about it. But we have to recognize this is not going to help our relationships. And for many relationships, this in itself becomes part of a pattern, and it becomes a habit, and it becomes the way we communicate regularly with one another. And so we're just constantly dysregulated, and it's very undisciplined. It's very kind of unhelpful. So yes, so that's what emotional dysregulation looks like, because a lot of us sort of think, oh, well, that's not me. I'm not like that. I'm like, it is you. It's all of us. We need to learn
all of
to
us.
regulate ourselves, because otherwise we are animals. We will react. And
So true.
like I was saying earlier, the anxious way of reacting and the avoidant way of reacting are different. The anxious and the avoidant can both be explosive and vent and fault find and criticize and name call and blame. Sadly, that seems to be part of the human condition across the board. But of course, the anxiously attached will get really preoccupied with the relationship. We get really hyper vigilant and over focused, and we want to talk things out, and we kind of escalate things. Whereas the avoidant, of course, shuts down, withdraws, withholds, stonewalls. Very different, opposing ways of coping, and that is what emotional dysregulation looks like for both those people. Again, this is a moment for avoidantly attached people to sort of feel a little bit superior and think, oh, well, I'm not overly emotional like these hysterical people over here. And they don't realize they are emotionally dysregulated, because numbing out and shutting down or being overly rational is a coping strategy. It's not a superior state of being. So again, we have to recognize, if I am too in my head and overly rational, I'm dysregulated. Or if I'm overly emotional and can't control myself and my emotions are just running the show, I'm dysregulated. So again, the emotional regulation techniques that we need to use in those moments are going to be different. If we are anxious and overly emotional, we've got to breathe. We've got to take a time out. We've got to go for a walk, go for a run. We need to journal. We need to vent to our friend, go to a therapist, sort of talk it out, really allow ourselves to be heard. If we are more avoidant in our processes, we need to get in touch with our feelings. We need to value what's going on. We need to think about our needs. We need to bring the focus back to ourselves and think about, what do I need in this moment? Right, because we're very good at blaming the other person and being dismissive, and it's all their fault and they're being kind of unreasonable, etc. We actually need to do the work of connecting with ourselves again, because with the numbing out, we've disconnected from ourselves.
Mm.
But, things that work very, very well for us when we are shutting down is things like routine and structure, activity, practical things that we can do more. That keeps us connected, because we're often going into our heads. And so we're sort of thinking things which we mistake for feeling things. So getting in touch with our feelings, doing physical things, kind of touching things, we all have to find out what works for us, and we can also find out what works that we can do with each other. So, for example, something that works a lot with people I work with is physical touch. When people are
Mm.
dysregulated and they're getting worked up, and one's getting worked up and one's shutting down, I just say, let's just stop, and we're going to do some breathing. You're going to connect with yourself. You're going to try to calm down. And we do that for a little bit. And then I say, I just want you to hold each other. And that might be holding hands, it might be holding a finger, whatever we feel that we can do in our hurt. Just touch each other. Just be flesh
I
on
love that.
flesh, because sometimes our words are so insufficient and they're like barriers in themselves. And if this is happening at home, if you can, that you're really winning, if that kind of thing happens in your relationship, and you can just say, let's just both shut up, let's lie on the sofa or go into the bedroom, and ideally take off our clothes and just hold each other, and just not say or do anything for like half an hour other than just hold each other, that will sort out so much more than the sort of overthinking, ranting that we actually want to do, because our bodies need the soothing, reassurance, validation, calm, care that our skin and bodies just naturally do with one another.
Oh,
So that's sort of
so
something to
good.
really work towards, and just understand it is a physical thing, this dysregulation. It's not a mental thing. Yes, our thoughts are involved, but it's our bodies. There's a real wisdom to our bodies of just calming our bodies down in whichever way we need. And our job is to explore what works for me, day to day for maintenance, emotional regulation, just yoga, stretching, walking, exercise, healthy food. And then what works for me in a moment when I am in it and I'm triggered. What works for me? Is it I've got to take some breaths? Is it a body scan? Is it a time out? Is it going for a run? Is it calling a friend? Is it punching a pillow? We've got to figure out what works for us, because we do need to do something, and it's often the
Mm.
opposite of what we want to do in those moments.
Of course. Thank you for sharing that with us, of things we could really start to ask ourselves, what helps me calm down and helps
Mm.
calm my nervous system. I know for myself, I love walks, walks
Mm.
outside, most importantly. That really helps me come back home to myself and feel a sense of peace.
Mm.
And so I think that's the question we should leave everybody with, is how do you
Mm.
find peace within yourself again, so that you could come back to a situation that is causing tension with more clarity, with more understanding, and then be able to, instead of reacting from your head, then responding from your heart. I think that would be a beautiful practice. So I think people should start questioning that, and how we could really,
Mm.
center ourselves again. So thank you. Well, I would love to just
Beautiful.
wrap up the interview and ask you the question I ask all my guests. If you were to share a piece of wisdom, a life lesson that you've just learned that you want to shout out to the world
Mm.
right now, what would that piece of wisdom be, and why?
Mm. Well, a wisdom that I have recently been reflecting on and thinking about. Um, and as a therapist, I suppose I do a lot of thinking and introspection and reflecting. Um, but I think about our impact on others. And I think in this world of ours, we are correctly very interested in our own lives and living big lives and fulfilling our dreams and wanting a lot for our one wild and precious life. And that's really, really important. But working as I do with people on their relationships, I think we really underestimate the impact that we have on each other. And if we can be more mindful about pretty much everything we do in our relationships is going to impact the other person. And maybe this sounds really kind of obvious, but when I observe my clients, there isn't that at the forefront of our minds. And I think it's very important that we do have that at the forefront of our minds, because we are accountable to each other, and what we are doing and what we are saying, how we are conducting ourselves, the atmosphere that we put out into the relationship, the language that we use, everything, it impacts others. And so I'm very, very keen on this idea of, please know that what you do impacts others, because often we come from quite a passive place where we feel, from our own hurt and our own wounds, no one cares about us, it doesn't matter what we do and whatever. And actually it does really matter. It's our impact can have far-reaching consequences, and it's very, very sad in our relationships today. A lot of negative stuff goes on in relationships. A lot of relationships aren't working out. And so just for us all to remember, we have an impact on each other. What impact do I want to make? I think is a really good, important thing to be conscious of.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, absolutely. Being responsible of how we show up in the world and how people could then relate to us. Beautifully said. Charisse, where can people best find you? Everything will be also plugged in the show notes, especially her book, The Attachment Solution, which is available for order. And where can people best find you?
I mean, I spend a huge amount of time on Instagram. I post every day. So if you can find me there at Charisse Cooke. I do reels and videos and lessons and reminders to just keep us all on track. So that's the best place to find me. I also have a website, charissecooke.com, with lots of free teachings there and also information about my offerings. So yeah, anywhere there is great.
Perfect. Thank you so much. This has been a wealth of information. I think it will really help people understand themselves and also partnership. And also, I didn't even mention, this is really great for parenting as well, especially if you're a new mom or dad, learning about how you could help your child form this awareness around how they relate to others. And this could be in friendship, this could be in partnership as well. So I think it's so helpful for parents to learn this, not only about themselves and their relationships, but also parenting. So
absolutely agree. Good point.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time. This has been so lovely, and so many tangible tools that we could take away to really get to know ourselves more and also our partners. So thank you for the conversation today.
Great. Thanks, Erica.